I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years and I've seen a lot of strange things on the road. But what happened to me one night on a desolate highway will stay with me forever. It was around midnight, and I was on a long haul, driving through a stretch of highway with nothing but darkness ahead and behind. The kind of road where the only light you see is your own headlights. My CB radio was silent, and the eerie quietness of the night started to get under my skin. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping to make it to the next truck stop without falling asleep at the wheel. That's when I saw her. At the edge of my high beam, standing at the side of the road, was a woman. She was dressed in a simple white dress, barefoot and holding her thumb out. Something about her seemed off. She didn't look dirty or like someone who had been walking for miles. She seemed out of place, too clean for the middle of nowhere. But I'm not one to leave anyone stranded on the road. I slowed down, rolling to a stop a few feet in front of her. I leaned over, opened the passenger side window and asked if she needed a ride. She didn't answer right away, just stared at me with wide eyes. Then without a word, she opened the door and climbed into the truck. Her silence made me uneasy, but I told myself she was probably just scared or cold. I asked her where she was headed, but again she said nothing. She simply pointed down the road, her pale hand trembling. For the next few minutes, we drove in complete silence. My eyes flickered over to her every so often, and every time I did, she was staring straight ahead, her eyes unblinking, her hands gripping her dress tightly. The air in the truck felt colder than it should have been, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter. Then she started to hum. It was this soft, eerie tune, almost like a lullaby, but something about it sent chills down my spine. I glanced over again, and that's when I noticed. Her feet weren't touching the floor. She was floating just above the seat. Panic surged through me. My foot slammed on the brakes and the truck came to a screeching halt. But when I turned to look at her, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Heart pounding, I jumped out of the truck and looked around. Nothing. The road was completely empty, just as it had been before I saw her. I even checked the side of the road where I had picked her up, but there was no trace of anyone. Shaken, I climbed back into my truck, locked the doors, and floored it. I drove until I reached the next truck stop and parked under the brightest lights I could find. Later, I found out that years ago, a woman had been killed in a car accident on that very stretch of road. Since then, truckers like me have reported picking up a woman late at night, only for her to vanish without a trace. I still drive that highway sometimes, but I'll never stop for a hitchhiker again. Not after that night. As a long-haul truck driver, you get used to the quiet nights, the endless stretches of highway, and the sense of isolation that comes with the job. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on a remote mountain road one night, deep in the Appalachian wilderness. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I was making my way through a particularly winding stretch of road. The fog was thick, so thick that I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. My headlights pierced through it just enough to show the narrow, twisting lanes. I was tired, but I still had a few hours to go before I could rest. That's when I saw the convoy. Up ahead, through the fog, I caught sight of the taillights of another truck. Relieved to not be the only one on this desolate road, I sped up just a little to keep pace. The truck was moving at a steady pace, and before long, I saw that there were several more trucks ahead of it. It looked like a whole convoy of rigs, all moving slowly but steadily through the fog. I felt a little more comfortable now, knowing I wasn't alone in this darkness. I switched on my CB radio to see if any of the drivers were chatting, but all I got was static. That was odd, but I figured maybe they were just keeping quiet. As we wound through the mountains, the fog only got thicker, and the road seemed to twist more sharply with every turn. The convoy stayed steady, their taillights a constant guide through the murk. But something started to bother me. I had been following these trucks for almost an hour, but I hadn't seen any road signs, exits, or even mile markers. It was as if we were driving through an endless loop of the same stretch of road. I tried flashing my headlights to get the attention of the truck in front of me. No response. I honked my horn. Still nothing. The trucks just kept moving forward at the same steady pace. The fog closed in even more, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. The air in my cab felt heavier, colder, and a strange sense of dread began to settle in my chest. Something was wrong. Really wrong. Finally, I decided to pull over and stop. I figured I'd let the convoy pass and maybe take a break to shake off this weird feeling. But as I slowed down and pulled to the side, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The trucks ahead of me. They weren't making any sound. No engines, no tires on the road, nothing. Just silence. I slammed on my brakes and my rig came to a halt. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the taillights of the truck in front of me. They flickered for a moment and then disappeared. The entire convoy, which had been just ahead of me, vanished into the fog without a trace. I jumped out of my cab and looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of any other trucks, no tire tracks, no sound of engines in the distance. Just the thick, suffocating fog and the eerie silence of the mountains. I got back in my truck, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove as fast as I could through the winding road, not stopping until I reached a small truck stop several miles away. When I told the clerk at the counter about the convoy, he gave me a strange look. He said I wasn't the first driver to see it. According to local legend, years ago, a convoy of trucks disappeared on that very road in a terrible accident. Their bodies were never recovered, and since then, drivers have reported seeing phantom convoys on foggy nights, always disappearing without a trace. To this day, I avoid that road whenever I can. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't anything of this world. Driving a truck long distance means you get used to late-night drives, empty roads, and rest stops in the middle of nowhere. But I'll never forget the night I made the mistake of stopping at one particular rest area, a night that still haunts me every time I pull into one of those places. It was around 3 a.m., and I had been driving for hours. I was exhausted, and my eyes were burning from staring at the road. My eyelids were getting heavier by the minute, and I knew I needed to pull over and take a quick nap before I fell asleep at the wheel. I spotted a sign for a rest stop up ahead, one of those small, barely used ones. Perfect. I pulled into the rest stop, which was nothing more than a parking lot with a couple of picnic tables and a small building with bathrooms. It was completely deserted, not a single car or truck in sight. I parked my rig, shut off the engine, and leaned back in my seat. The silence of the night was calming, and within minutes, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I had been out when I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like soft footsteps outside my truck, moving slowly around the cab. My heart started racing and I sat up, wiping the sleep from my eyes. I peered out the window but saw nothing, just the faint glow of the rest stop's single street light and the surrounding darkness. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a stray dog or something, and I settled back into my seat, trying to relax. But then I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my truck. This time they stopped just below my window. I froze. Something was out there. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it out the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot. I was starting to think I was imagining things when I heard a soft tapping on my driver's side door, like someone was lightly knocking. My blood ran cold. No way I was imagining that. I took a deep breath, reached for the door handle, and yanked the door open, shining my flashlight into the night. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the air felt different, colder, heavier, like something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was pounding in my chest and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I started the engine and was about to put the truck in gear when something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, just for a split second, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot, right where the light from the street lamp faded into darkness. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its silhouette was blurry, almost like it was shifting in and out of focus. But what really terrified me was that it seemed to be watching me. I couldn't make out any features, just the dark, looming presence. My stomach twisted in fear, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the rest stop as fast as my rig could go. I didn't look back, but I could still feel that thing's eyes on me, watching me as I drove away. I drove for miles, heart racing, until I reached a larger truck stop, filled with other trucks and lights. Only then did I feel safe enough to pull over again. I sat there in the safety of the bright lights for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The next day, I mentioned the experience to a fellow trucker I knew, expecting him to laugh or tell me I was just tired. But instead, his face went pale. "You were at that rest stop, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, surprised by his reaction. "Yeah, why?" He took a deep breath and told me that the rest stop had a reputation among truckers. Years ago, a truck driver had been murdered there, stabbed to death by a hitchhiker. The killer was never caught, and ever since, drivers have reported strange things happening when they stop there. Footsteps, knocking on their doors, and, most terrifying of all, sightings of a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. I hadn't known about the murder, but hearing it made my skin crawl. I didn't doubt the story for a second. I had experienced it myself, whatever that thing was. Now, every time I pass that stretch of highway, I avoid that rest stop like the plague. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. There's something evil out there, and it's waiting for the next unlucky driver to stop.